What if I told you the Messiah did not walk alone, that beneath the quiet veil of his holiness, there were others who shared his blood, silent witnesses to the light, hidden by time, erased by the kingdoms that feared their memory? Have you ever wondered what became of his family? The mother who wept when the world forgot her son's words, the brothers who carried his shadow through the villages of Galilee, the sister whose silence became her scripture. What if the blood of the Messiah still moves unseen, through forgotten valleys and exiled tribes, carrying the echo of a divine promise that never died? Stay until the end, and you will hear what was once whispered only among the watchers of faith, the story heaven buried to protect the earth from its own remembrance. If your soul remembers the light, stay with us. Subscribe and walk this ancient path once more into the silence where faith was born and memory becomes prayer. Before the world called him Messiah, he was simply a child barefoot in the dust of Galilee, laughter soft as wind against the olive leaves. The hills were quiet then. Only the hum of bees and the slow breath of stone carried through the air. In a small house built from sun-bleached clay, light gathered each morning like a guest who never knocked. Mary would rise before dawn. Her hands were worn from kneading bread and prayer alike. She would whisper verses she barely understood, fragments of old psalms, lines that came to her in dreams. Each word felt like a secret flame, keeping her home warm against the chill of the empire. She knew her son was different. The air itself seemed to listen when he spoke. Even the lambs paused near the doorway, as if some ancient promise lived within the walls. The neighbors would pass by and see the boy working beside Joseph, shaping wood with quiet patience. They thought him kind, perhaps too soft for a world ruled by swords. But when his eyes lifted, something eternal stirred, not pride, not defiance, only a calm that made even soldiers hesitate. He was the stillness before a storm that would one day cleanse the earth. At night, Mary's other children would sleep close together. James, strong and thoughtful, watched over his younger brothers. Hoseas dreamed of the sea. Simon often spoke in riddles, claiming he could hear angels whispering through the wind. And the youngest, Judas, carried a restless fire he did not yet understand. They loved their elder brother but did not fully know him. To them he was both kind and mysterious, a presence too vast to touch, too gentle to fear. Sometimes, when moonlight spilled across the courtyard, he would sit apart and trace patterns in the sand, circles, stars, flowing lines that vanished with the morning wind. Mary would watch from the doorway, feeling a strange ache rise in her chest. She wanted to ask what he saw in those lines, but each time she opened her mouth, silence would answer her, thick and golden. The land beyond Nazareth groaned under the Roman yoke. Taxes pressed like stones upon the poor, and soldiers patrolled the roads with eyes of iron. Yet somehow this house remained untouched, hidden not by walls but by grace. Travelers who wandered too near would forget their path, as if a gentle fog had turned them aside. The old women said angels guarded that home, though none dared to look too closely. Within those clay walls, time moved differently. The boy grew, but his spirit stretched beyond seasons. He spoke little, listened often, and when he prayed, the earth itself seemed to breathe with him. His brothers would watch and whisper, "Why does the sky seem closer when he stands outside? Why do the birds fall silent until he finishes his prayer?" Mary would smile softly, but fear shadowed her eyes. She remembered the angel's voice, the promise and the warning woven together like light and shadow. She wondered how one could raise a child who belonged both to heaven and to the dust. Sometimes she would brush his hair aside and whisper, "My son, when the world learns your name, may it still remember your gentleness." He would answer only with a smile that felt older than time. And when storms came, thunder rolling over the valley, he would stand by the doorway unafraid. Lightning would flash against his face, and in that moment he seemed both boy and dawn, a quiet fire wrapped in flesh. The others would hide under blankets, praying the sky would spare them. But he would whisper to the storm, and the wind would falter as if recognizing an ancient command. The hidden house of Nazareth was no palace. It smelled of bread, oil, and cedar. Yet within its silence, heaven learned the language of man. Angels unseen bowed in the corners while dust floated like prayer in the sunlight. Every moment was ordinary, yet every heartbeat carried eternity's pulse. For this was where salvation first learned to breathe, not in temples of marble, but in a mother's sigh, in the laughter of brothers, in the soft crackle of a wood fire beneath the stars. The Messiah's story did not begin with miracles or crowns. It began here in the smallest home, where the divine hid itself in love so humble that even time dared not disturb it. There was a fragrance in Nazareth that no one could name, not incense, nor cedar smoke, nor the bloom of spring herbs from the valley below. It was the scent of peace before the world remembered what peace was. Each evening, when the last light of the sun faded behind the ridges, that fragrance would linger in the air, soft and still, as if heaven itself was breathing close. In that hour between day and night, Mary would hum to herself. Her songs were not of words, but of remembrance, melodies older than speech, carried through the hearts of prophets and mothers before her. The children would listen, drowsy from the heat, and somewhere among them sat the boy destined to divide time itself. Yet to her he was simply her child, the one who smiled before storms, who whispered comfort to frightened animals, who stared into the distance as if listening to voices no one else could hear. The people of the town began to notice strange things. A sick goat healed after drinking from the family's basin. The well behind their house never ran dry, even in drought. Once, when a carpenter's son broke his arm, the boy from Nazareth wrapped it in cool cloth and said only, "Be still." By morning the bone was whole again. The villagers whispered and rumor rippled through the air like unseen fire. But Mary would bow her head and say nothing. She knew that miracles were not meant to be owned, they were meant to pass through, like wind through reeds. Sometimes, when night deepened and the house was asleep, the boy would slip outside. He would walk barefoot into the field and stand among the tall grass, looking toward the stars. The sky above Galilee was vast, a mirror of eternity, and in it he could feel the same silence that lived within him. The heavens seemed to pulse, almost breathing, and the stars shimmered like eyes that recognized their maker. He would stay there for hours, unmoving, until the first hint of dawn touched the horizon. Birds would stir, and he would whisper something not in any known tongue, a language of stillness, of gratitude, of belonging. The trees would sway though no wind blew, and the earth beneath his feet would tremble softly as if listening. James would sometimes follow, curious yet afraid to be seen. He would hide behind the olive trees, watching his brother glow faintly under the moon. He wanted to speak, to ask what he saw up there, but something held him still, the feeling that this moment was not meant for words. Later, when they walked home together in silence, James would look at him and wonder, is this what it means to walk between heaven and earth? Mary sensed what her children could not name. She saw the way the boy carried both sorrow and serenity in his gaze, as though he remembered something the world had forgotten. She once asked Joseph quietly, "How do we prepare for what he will become?" Joseph, ever a man of earth and wood, only replied, "By keeping his feet clean and his heart unbroken." There was wisdom in that simplicity, so they guarded him not with walls but with love. They taught him how to shape wood, how to bless bread, how to greet neighbors with peace. The divine learned humility through their daily care. Every task became a prayer, every nail a verse, every loaf of bread a testimony to the sacred hidden in ordinary hands. Years later, travelers would recall glimpses of a boy who seemed to see straight into the soul. They would remember his kindness, how he listened longer than anyone else, how he asked questions that made old men weep, how he carried calm like a mantle even when surrounded by hunger and noise. But in those early years, he belonged only to silence, to the quiet rhythm of his mother's breath, the rustle of grain, the hum of life before destiny awakened. The world outside was loud with conquest and fear, but inside that small house, time bowed its head. And if you had passed by on one of those still nights, you might have heard it, a soft murmur carried on the wind, not quite prayer, not quite song, the sound of heaven remembering itself in the heart of a child. There were days when the sky above Nazareth seemed heavy with unspoken words. Clouds moved slowly over the hills, carrying a weight that even the birds hesitated to disturb. The boy would sit beneath the fig tree, shaping small pieces of wood into doves. His hands were gentle yet firm, every motion deliberate, as if each carving was a form of prayer. When he finished, he would lift the little figure toward the light and breathe upon it softly, and for a heartbeat it seemed to move, its wings trembling in the still air before falling silent again. Mary often watched from the window, her thoughts tangled between awe and worry. She knew what the angel had promised, that her son would be a sign, that through him, nations would rise and fall. But she also knew what the world did to those who carried light. Light is beautiful, yes, but it also exposes. It burns away shadows, and in doing so, it invites fear. She feared not for his soul, but for his flesh, for the path that every prophet must walk, between love and rejection, between blessing and betrayal. One evening, when the family gathered for supper, Joseph told a story about King David. His voice was deep and steady, filling the small room with warmth. The children listened closely, but the boy's gaze drifted to the window. The night was deep and full of stars, and in their glow he seemed to hear something calling. After a moment he turned to his brothers and said quietly, "The throne David built was not made of stone. It was made of faith." The words fell into the air like a seed into soil. The room went silent. Even Joseph's hands trembled slightly before he smiled, humbled by the mystery that had spoken through his son. The next morning the family awoke to find the fig tree in bloom, though it was not its season. Its branches shimmered with dew, heavy with fruit. The neighbors came to see, whispering again of wonders. Some said it was a blessing, others feared it was a sign. But to Mary it was neither a miracle nor an omen, it was a reminder that heaven's timing was not man's timing, that what is sacred cannot be hurried nor hidden forever. As the years passed, Nazareth remained a quiet corner of a restless empire. Soldiers marched through the roads, kings rose and fell in distant lands. But within that little house, the divine continued to grow in silence. The boy became taller, his voice deeper, yet his heart remained as gentle as before. He spoke to strangers with kindness, tended to the weak, and worked beside Joseph as if each plank of wood carried the weight of eternity. At dusk, when the last rays of sun brushed the fields gold, he would walk to the edge of town where the hills rolled into the horizon. There he would kneel and press his hand to the earth, whispering words that no one else could understand. The ground would grow warm beneath his palm, and small flowers would bloom in his wake, silent testimonies to a love that could not be contained by language. James would often join him there. He asked once timidly, "Brother, what do you say when you speak to the ground?" The boy smiled and answered, "I tell it not to be afraid of dying." James did not understand, but something inside him stirred the first echo of faith. At night, when the lamps were dimmed, Mary would lie awake and listen to the sounds of sleep. The quiet breathing of her children, the whisper of wind through the reeds, and beneath it all she could sense something vast moving, as if heaven itself was holding its breath. She would close her eyes and pray, not for miracles, not for glory, but for gentleness. For the world to be kind enough to receive what it did not yet deserve. And so the boy who would one day change all of time remained hidden, learning the patience of the earth, the rhythm of the stars, the silence of God. The world was not ready to hear his name, but Nazareth knew, the stones knew, the fig tree knew. And Mary, she carried the secret of that light the way dawn carries the promise of morning, softly, faithfully, without a sound. The house on the hill slept under the gaze of eternity, and for a little while longer, heaven allowed it to remain unseen. There are nights when even heaven feels far away. Nights when faith becomes a weight rather than a wing. Mary knew those nights well. In the hush between prayers, when her children slept and the lamp's flame trembled low, she would sit beside the window and listen, not for angels, not for prophecy, but for the quiet sound of her own heart. It beat slowly, stubbornly, beneath the memory of the angel's promise. "You are blessed among women," he had said, and yet she often wondered if blessing always felt this heavy, this lonely. Nazareth slept around her, unaware of the storm she carried in silence. To the townspeople, she was just another mother, her hair silvering, her eyes gentle, her days filled with the rhythm of tending, mending, and waiting. But within her, a question never left. How does one mother the eternal? How do you hold a son who does not truly belong to you, knowing one day the world will take him and call it holy? Sometimes, in the blue hour before dawn, she would find him already awake. The boy, no longer a child, but not yet a man, standing at the edge of the courtyard, gazing toward the horizon. His face was calm, yet filled with something she could not name. She would step closer and whisper, "Come, my son. The night is cold." But he would smile, that same knowing smile that seemed to pierce through time, and say softly, "The night is only dark for those who forget the stars." Then he would return to his mat, lie beside his brothers, and close his eyes. Mary would remain standing, her breath trembling between love and fear, for she could feel destiny like a shadow in the room, gentle but unyielding. The years passed quietly, and yet each day drew her closer to the unspoken prophecy. She began to notice how the air changed when he entered a room, how people felt both comforted and exposed in his presence. A merchant once came to their home, sick and trembling. He could barely stand, his eyes sunken with fever. Without a word, her son placed his hand upon the man's shoulder. The fever broke before the prayer was finished. The merchant wept and called him holy, but Mary felt no pride, only a deeper sorrow. For she knew what holiness demanded. It never lets you rest. At night she dreamt of light too bright to look at, too vast to flee from. In her dream she would see her son walking into that light alone. She would call his name, but her voice would vanish into the brilliance. When she awoke, her pillow was damp with tears she did not remember shedding. She told no one. Not Joseph, not James, not even the winds that sometimes seemed to whisper her thoughts back to her. Some burdens are too sacred to share. During one winter, when the olive trees stood bare, she fell ill for many weeks. Her son tended to her with hands that never wavered, feeding her water drop by drop, humming songs older than language. Once, as her fever burned high, she opened her eyes and saw his face close to hers, calm, luminous, as if the whole sky lived behind his gaze. And she realized then, her child did not pray to heaven, he prayed with it. When spring returned, she recovered, but something within her had changed. She spoke less, smiled more softly, and often lingered at the threshold at dusk, as if expecting a visitor only she could see. She began to understand that motherhood for her was not possession, it was surrender. To love him meant to release him, moment by moment, into the will of the one who had sent him. It was a gentle dying of her own desires, replaced by an infinite patience that only mothers of prophets seem to know. And so Mary lived, half in the world and half in the mystery. She cooked, cleaned, and prayed, but beneath every act of love there was the echo of her secret burden, the knowledge that the same child she kissed goodnight would one day carry the weight of every sorrow that ever was. Her heart bore it all quietly, faithfully, until even heaven bowed its head. The seasons moved gently through Nazareth. Olive trees budded and fell asleep again. The fields shifted from gold to green to dust. Yet within Mary, time was no longer a straight line. It was a circle, turning endlessly around a single light. Each morning she would rise before the sun, sweep the floor, and lay out bread for her children. Her hands never paused, yet her thoughts drifted like smoke. She remembered the manger, the distant star, the trembling shepherds. How small he had been then, how human, how utterly fragile. She remembered the warmth of his breath against her neck, the scent of hay and heaven. Those memories lived in her like sacred fire, tender but never still. Her other sons grew tall and restless. They spoke of trade, of work, of the future, but he spoke of silence. When neighbors came to seek counsel, he would listen more than he spoke. His answers, when they came, were never direct. He did not command, he revealed. Once, when a man asked why God seemed distant, he replied, "The wind does not leave you when it grows still. It only waits for you to listen." Mary heard these words and felt both awe and ache. For every revelation he gave drew him further from her reach. Each truth he spoke was a step away from home, toward the path that prophecy had already written. She saw it in his eyes, the quiet longing, the pull toward something far beyond Nazareth's hills. One evening, when the sky was drenched in violet and the scent of figs filled the air, she found him sitting beneath the olive tree again. The birds had settled in silence around him. "My son, do you ever wish to be ordinary?" He looked up thoughtful, as though tasting the question. Then he said, "If I were ordinary, the world would never learn what peace feels like." The simplicity of his answer broke her. She turned her face away so he would not see the tears. He stood, approached her, and took her hands, the hands that had washed and fed and guided him since birth. "Mother," he whispered, "the burden you carry is not punishment. It is the shadow of love's own light." She pressed his palms to her face, feeling the warmth pulse beneath his skin, the pulse of creation itself. For a fleeting moment she wished she could freeze the world there, keep him as he was, her child, her miracle, her secret. But the air trembled, and she knew the moment would pass. All things divine must continue their journey. That night, as the moon climbed above the hills, Mary knelt alone in the courtyard. Her voice was barely a whisper. "O my Lord, I do not ask for understanding, only for strength to endure what I already know." The wind rose gently, carrying her words away like petals into the stars. The next morning the town awoke to stories of a wonder. A child from a nearby village had been dying, fevered and weak. Her son had gone quietly without announcement and sat by the child's bedside. He said little, only sang a soft prayer. By dawn, the fever had vanished. The people called him blessed, a prophet, a healer. But when he returned home, his face was still and sad. Mary waited until the others slept before asking, "Why do you weep when miracles happen?" He looked at her and said, "Because each one brings the cross closer." Her breath caught. She did not know what he meant fully, but her soul shivered as if it had heard thunder far away. After that night, she began to see signs everywhere, fleeting glimpses of the inevitable. A broken jar mended by his touch. A dove landed upon his shoulder unafraid. A stranger bowing before him without knowing why. The veil between heaven and earth grew thin in his presence, and she, the keeper of his first breath, felt the world itself preparing for something vast, something sorrowful, something holy. And yet, even with that burden pressing against her heart, she remained tender. She laughed with her children, shared bread with the poor, sang old songs under her breath while she worked. Because love, she knew, is not the absence of fear, it is the courage to face it gently. So Mary carried her secret burden as the stars carried their light, silently, endlessly, until her soul became as calm as dawn itself. There came a morning when the light itself felt heavy, the kind of dawn that carried no warmth, only the pale hush before revelation. Mary woke early, her bones aching with the memory of dreams she could not name. She had seen her son again, but not as the boy of Nazareth. In the dream, he stood upon a hill, surrounded by crowds who called his name with tears and fear. And behind him she saw a shadow, long, sharp, and shaped like wood. When she woke, her pillow was wet with tears. She went about her chores as always, though her heart throbbed beneath the calm of her hands. The house smelled of flour and oil, the rhythm of daily life unchanged. But she felt the air thick with something unseen, as though heaven itself was waiting for her to understand what it had already decided. Her son was no longer a child. His presence filled the room like morning fills the sea. He spoke rarely now, but when he did, the words seemed to come from another world. Once, when his brothers argued over inheritance, he said simply, "Do not gather what time will scatter. Gather what love will remember." The room fell silent. Even the quarrel died in reverence. Mary felt the truth of it strike her like light. He no longer spoke as one who sought wisdom, he spoke as one who was wisdom. The neighbors noticed too. They began to whisper of strange peace that followed him, of laughter returning to homes after his visits, of crops that flourished after his prayers. And with wonder came danger. For light, once it shines too brightly, cannot hide. One afternoon, soldiers passed through Nazareth. Mary stood by the well, drawing water, when one of them stopped to rest. He glanced toward her home and said, "They say a holy man lives here, is it true?" Mary felt her throat tight. She answered softly, "Only a carpenter's son." The soldier studied her face, then smiled faintly. "Then may your carpenter keep his hands clean," he said, and walked away. She returned home shaken. Her son sat at the table, mending a wooden yoke. She told him what had happened. He looked at her with calm eyes that seemed to see far beyond the horizon. "Mother," he said, "no one can hide a flame forever. Even the sun begins as a spark." That night Mary could not sleep. She watched him resting, his face serene, his breathing even, and she realized that she was not afraid for his safety anymore. She was afraid for the world, for how it would receive a love so pure that it could undo everything it believed about itself. In the silence of that realization, she prayed again, not to change the future, but to find peace in its coming. Her prayer was not made of words, but of surrender. "Let what must come, come gently," her heart whispered, and heaven heard her. From that day forward, her fear softened into reverence. She no longer tried to understand the mystery within her home. She simply lived inside it, the way a candle lives inside its flame. When she saw her son smile, she no longer asked what he thought of. When he walked into the hills, she did not follow. She waited and trusted the wind that always carried him back. Once, as the sun set crimson across the fields, he turned to her and said, "Do not grieve, mother. Even when I am gone, I will not be gone." She did not answer. She only reached out and touched his cheek, the same gesture she had made when he was small, and whispered, "Then promise me you will return with the dawn." He smiled. "I never leave the dawn." Those words became her final comfort. Whenever the days grew dark and the rumors of the empire's wrath spread through the valley, she would look toward the morning sky and whisper to herself, "He never leaves the dawn." And so, Mary bore her secret burden until it no longer felt like weight but like light, the kind of light that does not fade but transforms. She had carried divinity in her womb, but now she carried it in her silence. The burden of being chosen had become the grace of being still. For the holiest act is not in miracles, nor prophecy, it is in the quiet endurance of love. And Mary, mother of the Messiah, keeper of the impossible, became the first to understand that love's truest form is surrender. Not every story written in heaven finds its echo on earth. Some names are spoken once, then vanish like breath on glass. Among those names are the brothers of the Messiah. They lived in the same house, ate from the same bread, and drank from the same well. And yet history buried their faces in silence, as if the light of one sun was too bright for the world to see the others beside him. James was the eldest after him, steady, quiet, and full of questions he never dared to ask. He had his mother's calm but his father's eyes that saw truth even when it wounded. From a young age, he knew his brother was unlike any other. When they worked together in the carpenter's shed, James would glance at him and wonder how his hands that built tables and mended doors, could also hold the power that shaped stars. Hosea's was different. Restless, eager, his laughter often broke the stillness of their small home. He loved his brother deeply, but he did not understand him. To Hosea's, holiness was distance, something that belonged to prophets and angels, not to the boy who fetched water and sang softly while mending tools. Yet as they grew older, he began to sense that the line between heaven and earth had blurred within their family. Simon, thoughtful and quiet, felt it most of all. He watched the way people looked at his brother, the mixture of awe and confusion, and he wondered what it must feel like to carry that kind of light. There were nights when Simon dreamed he could see it, a faint glow around his brother's head as he prayed, soft as the moon's edge on still water. He never told anyone. Some visions are too sacred to share. And then there was Judas, the youngest. He was a storm in human form, passionate, stubborn, hungry for understanding. He loved his brother fiercely but wrestled with jealousy too. He could not bear to be near the light without trying to touch it. When his brother spoke of peace, Judas asked for justice. When others listened in silence, Judas demanded answers. "If you have power," he once said, "why not use it to break the chains of Rome? Why whisper when the world is burning?" His brother looked at him not with anger but with sorrow, because a flame that burns too quickly leaves no warmth behind. Judas turned away, unsatisfied. Yet in his heart those words never stopped echoing. Mary watched all this unfold with a mother's quiet grief. She loved each of them, each reflection of her own heart, but she saw how the divine presence of one son reshaped the others. To grow beside holiness is to be both blessed and tested. The brothers were like planets circling a star too bright to look upon. They loved him, but they also longed to be free of the gravity that bound them to his mystery. There were moments of warmth, too. On long evenings after the harvest, they would all sit together beneath the fig tree, their laughter rising with the smell of bread and oil. He would tell stories, simple ones, of farmers and seeds, of lamps and hidden treasures. The brothers would smile, not realizing that each story was a window into eternity. But as the years passed, the distance grew. He began to travel, drawn by a calling that only heaven understood. Crowds gathered where he walked. Rumors spread. The family home grew quiet, and the brothers began to feel the ache of his absence. James tried to lead in his stead, caring for their mother, keeping the household steady. Yet even he sometimes stood at the doorway at dusk, watching the hills, wondering when or if his brother would return. And though none of them spoke it aloud, they all felt the same ache, the ache of being close to something infinite, yet unable to claim it. They lived in the shadow of the divine and learned that love, in its purest form, often means standing in that shadow without envy, without pride. They were the forgotten brothers of the Messiah, chosen not for glory, but for silence. And sometimes, silence is the holiest calling of all. There were days when the brothers would walk the dusty roads of Galilee together, the sun pressing down on their shoulders like an invisible hand. The air shimmered with heat, the kind that makes the horizon look like water. They spoke of simple things, the cost of grain, the sound of distant drums, the laughter of children chasing shadows near the fields. But behind their words lingered something unspoken, the quiet knowledge that their lives were forever bound to a story far larger than themselves. James often walked a few steps behind him. He did not mean to, but reverence slowed his pace. He could feel something radiant flowing from his brother's presence, not pride, not power, but a peace that seemed to hum through the air. Once he asked softly, "Why do people listen when you speak?" His brother looked at the sky for a moment before replying, "Because when I speak, they hear their own hearts remembering." Those words struck James like light breaking through fog. He would recall them years later, after the world had changed, when his brother's name would echo across nations. But in that moment, they simply walked together, their shadows stretching long across the road. Simon often said little, but his eyes carried the stillness of deep water. He watched his brother heal the sick and speak with authority that made scholars tremble, yet he saw no arrogance, only compassion. One evening, he found him washing the feet of a beggar, humming an old lullaby their mother once sang. The sight pierced him. "You could command angels," Simon whispered, "yet you kneel." His brother smiled faintly and said, "Even the sun must bow to the dawn before it rises." Hosea struggled with that kind of humility. He loved his brother, but he could not understand the choice to remain small when greatness waited so near. "You were meant to rule," he said one night by the fire. "Why do you live like a servant?" His brother's eyes reflected the flames. "Because love does not rule," he said. "It serves." Hosea's turned away, ashamed, though he did not know why. And Judas, the youngest, wrestled with the fiercest storm. His heart was a forge where faith and doubt struck sparks against each other. He followed his brother's words but wanted to see the world burn with them. He could not stand injustice, the Roman banners, the cruelty of the tax collectors, the endless hunger of the poor. "If you truly carry heaven's power," he said, "then break the empire. Show them who you are." His brother did not rebuke him. He simply touched Judas's chest over his heart and whispered, "The empire I came to break is not built of stone." Judas said nothing, but his fists clenched in silence. Mary heard their quarrels sometimes through the walls, brothers divided not by hatred, but by wonder. She would stand in the courtyard and pray that heaven would keep them from misunderstanding one another. For she knew that divine purpose is a sharp blade, and those who stand too near its edge often bleed. Still, there were moments of peace, rare and precious. In the evenings, when the stars began to tremble into view, the brothers would gather with their mother and share bread beneath the olive tree. He would bless the meal, not with ceremony, but with gentleness. "May this bread remind us that we are more than hungry," he would say. And as they ate, something sacred settled between them, a silence so pure it felt like the breath of God moving through their small family. But peace never lasts where prophecy has spoken. As word spread of miracles and teachings, the roads to Nazareth began to fill with strangers, the sick, the desperate, the curious. Some came in awe, others in anger. The brothers stood at the threshold of their home, unsure whether to protect him or follow. They felt the weight of his growing name, the same name that would one day lift the world but now made their small village tremble with uncertainty. That night, James lay awake listening to the wind. He thought of his brother's voice, the calm in his eyes, the strange, unbearable beauty of his destiny. "We share his blood," James whispered to himself, "but do we share his light?" Outside, a storm gathered over the hills. And within that storm, heaven began to turn another page of the story, one that the brothers were never meant to control, only to witness. The storm broke before dawn. Thunder rolled across the hills like the voice of something ancient remembering itself. The brothers rose early, drawn by the sound, and found him standing outside beneath the olive tree. Rain soaked his robe, but he did not move. His eyes were fixed upon the horizon, where the light of morning tried to pierce the clouds. James approached first, his voice low. "Brother, come inside, the storm will pass." He turned and smiled, water glimmering on his face like tears. "Some storms are not meant to be avoided," he said. "They are meant to be listened to." And so they stood there with him, James, Simon, Hoseas, and Judas, each uncertain of what they were witnessing. The rain softened into a mist, and for a moment the air itself seemed to breathe. It was as if heaven and earth were whispering to each other through the sound of falling water. Later that day, when the storm had faded, he gathered them quietly in the courtyard. The sky was pale again, washed clean. He spoke not as a brother, but as one who knew his time of obscurity was nearing its end. "You will hear of me in places far beyond these hills," he said. "Some will love me, some will curse my name, but remember, I did not come to be followed. I woke up." James felt a tightening in his chest. He wanted to protest, to ask why awakening required distance, why love so often meant departure. But when he looked at his brother's face, he saw no pride, no farewell, only the soft gravity of purpose. Mary watched from the doorway. She did not interrupt. She understood what her sons could not yet bear to name, that this was the moment the family began to fracture, not in bitterness, but in the ache of destiny fulfilled. As months passed, the house of Nazareth grew quieter. He began to travel farther, his voice carrying across villages, his name gathering weight like a storm gathering clouds. People spoke of healing, of bread multiplied, of spirits cast down. But among the family there was both pride and confusion. Neighbors whispered that his own kin doubted him. Some said the brothers tried to restrain him, fearing he had lost his mind. Others claimed they sought to protect him from the priests and soldiers already plotting against him. The truth, as always, was simpler and more human. They did not doubt his goodness, they feared his path. One evening a messenger came running up the road, breathless. "He is preaching again," the man said, "near the lake. The crowds are so many he cannot even eat." The brothers looked at each other. James turned to Mary. "We should go," he said. "He needs rest." They traveled for half a day through dust and heat, their hearts pulled between duty and wonder. When they reached the gathering, they could barely see him through the sea of faces. He stood upon a hill, calm amid the noise, speaking of forgiveness as if it were sunlight itself. Someone in the crowd pointed toward them and said, "Your mother and brothers are here." The people turned, expectant, and he looked out over the multitude and said, "Who is my mother? Who are my brothers? Those who hear the word and keep it, they are my family." The words fell like stones into the silence. Mary closed her eyes, her hands trembling. James stood frozen, unsure whether to feel wounded or enlightened. Judas turned away in anger. "We came for him," he muttered, "and he calls strangers his kin." But even then, deep within their hearts, they knew he was not rejecting them. He was expanding the circle of love until it no longer had walls. Still, the human heart is slow to accept what heaven reveals. That night, as they walked home beneath a moon half veiled by clouds, no one spoke. The path was long, and each carried their own silence like a stone. Only Mary's lips moved in prayer, not for explanation, but for endurance. For she knew what her sons were only beginning to learn, that to love the divine is to be stretched beyond the limits of family, of name, of self. The forgotten brothers would one day remember. They would understand that they were not cast aside, but chosen to bear witness, to stand in the quiet shadow of the world's brightest light. And though their names would fade from Scripture's pages, heaven still remembers them, the brothers who carried the ache of holiness in human hearts. There is a silence in every sacred story, a name half spoken, a face the world forgets to remember. Between the brothers and the mother there was one more, a sister, whose memory slipped like smoke through the cracks of Scripture. Her name was Salome, or perhaps Miriam, the scrolls disagree, and time itself no longer seems certain. Yet the wind that once moved through Nazareth still carries her echo, soft and sorrowful like the breath of a candle before it fades. She was born in the season of rain, when the earth smelled of new beginnings. Mary said her cry was gentler than her brother's, a voice that hummed like water finding its path through stone. From the start, she saw what others overlooked. She noticed how the doves landed on her eldest brother's shoulder without fear, how the shadows bent toward him when he prayed. She would watch in silence, her small hands pressed together, knowing somehow that her life would be spent near holiness, though never in its light. In those early years, she followed him everywhere. When he fetched water from the well, she carried the smaller jar behind him. When he carved wood, she gathered the shavings like treasure. Once, when he was mending a door, she asked, "Why do you fix what men will only break again?" He smiled and said, "Because mercy must begin somewhere." Those words became the first seed of wisdom in her young heart. But girls in Galilee were not meant to linger in mystery. As she grew, the world pulled her back into its narrow spaces, tending to fire, weaving cloth, learning the rhythm of silence that women were born into. Her brothers went to the fields to work to the world. She remained near her mother, watching through open windows as the men's voices drifted like songs carried on the wind. Yet she never forgot the feeling that her brother's life was not just his own. She saw how Mary's eyes grew darker each year, how the air in their home changed when he was near, not tense, but expectant, like the pause before rain. She began to dream strange dreams, of light spilling from wounds, of voices speaking in thunder, of a crown that shone and burned at once. When she told Mary, her mother only kissed her forehead and said, "Do not speak these dreams aloud, my daughter. The world fears what women see." As her brother's name began to echo beyond Nazareth, strangers started visiting their door. Some came in awe, others came in suspicion. Salome watched from behind the curtain, seeing both devotion and danger in their faces. Once, a Roman officer passed through the village and spoke to her father. His words were courteous, his tone gentle, yet his eyes lingered too long on the house. That night Mary told her daughter, "Do not stand by the window again. The world looks for light, but not all who seek it come in peace." In time, Salome's presence faded from the village gossip. Some said she married a fisherman near Capernaum. Others whispered she joined the women who followed her brother in secret, tending to the sick and carrying water for his disciples. And then nothing. History swallowed her whole. But there are fragments faint as dust on forgotten parchment that suggest she walked further than anyone knew. Some say she traveled east after his death, carrying with her the words he had once whispered beside the well. She taught in whispers, prayed in silence, and healed with touch. Wherever she went, the air softened around her, as if her brother's spirit walked beside her unseen. Others say she never left Nazareth, that she vanished not by distance, but by surrender. That one day she simply walked into the hills before dawn, her veil fluttering like a bird in flight, and never returned. Some claim a shepherd found her footprints leading into a cave where the wind sang like a lullaby. No one knows for certain. But sometimes, when the night grows still and the olive trees sway like ancient souls in prayer, the villagers say they can hear a woman's voice humming beyond the valley, a song without words, tender and eternal. And they say that is Salome, the sister who vanished, the keeper of her brother's silence, the forgotten light behind the light. The stories that remain of her are fragments, scattered like seeds across the centuries. They speak of a woman who moved like wind through the villages of Galilee, silent, unseen, but always arriving where sorrow lived. Those who met her never learned her name, but they remembered her eyes. They said her gaze carried both dawn and morning, as if she had witnessed the birth of light and its breaking all at once. She wore no jewels and carried no coins. Her robe was plain, the color of sand at dusk. And yet wherever she walked, people felt the air soften. A dying child would sleep more easily after her touch. A quarreling family would fall silent when she entered their home. It was as though she carried a quiet piece of her brother's peace, a remnant of his mercy woven into her very breath. There was one tale, old and nearly forgotten, that told of a night near Capernaum. A man had lost his sight after witnessing violence in the market. No physician could help him, but a woman came to him at dusk, asking for no payment, only stillness. She pressed her palms over his eyes and whispered, "Do you remember what color forgiveness is?" The man wept. When he opened his eyes, he could see again, but when he turned to thank her, she was gone. The villagers called her the silent healer, the sister of mercy, the woman who walks with the wind. Some thought she was an angel, others a ghost. But among those who knew the stories of Nazareth, a few whispered her true name, Salome, daughter of Mary, sister of the one they called the Light. In the long years after her brother's death, she wandered the borders of faith and grief. She visited places he had walked, the lake where he taught, the hills where he prayed, the garden where his blood had touched the earth. She gathered memories the way others gathered grain, storing them in her heart. "If the world forgets him," she once said to a fisherman, "then the wind will remember." But remembering was not enough. Her brother's words echoed in her sleep, and she felt called to live them, not to preach, not to perform miracles, but to keep love alive through kindness so small the world would never notice. She tended to the old, carried water for strangers, mended the cloaks of travelers. Every act was a prayer, every breath a hymn. Sometimes at twilight she would climb the hills above the village and watch the sun sink into the sea. She would whisper, "I am still here," as though speaking to someone far beyond the clouds. The breeze would stir, gentle and warm, and she would close her eyes, feeling his presence pass through her once more. But even in her holiness, she was human. There were nights when loneliness crept upon her like the desert cold. Nights when she longed for her mother's voice, for the laughter of her brothers, for the warmth of a home that no longer existed. On those nights, she wept not out of despair, but out of the ache of remembrance. For love, even divine love, can break the heart that holds it too long. It is said that as she grew old, Her hair turned white as linen and her hands trembled like leaves. She lived near the edge of a small village, in a stone hut covered with vines. No one knew where she came from, only that she had a way of making the sick feel seen and the grieving feel less alone. The children loved her most. They said she told stories about stars that could hear prayers. And then, one morning, the villagers found her door open, her mat empty, and the scent of myrrh in the air. There were no footprints, no sign of struggle, only a piece of linen folded neatly beside a cup of water. Some said she had gone into the hills to die. Others believed she had simply walked back into the light. That night, a shepherd tending his flock swore he saw a figure standing among the olive trees, a woman dressed in the color of twilight, her veil glowing faintly in the moonlight. She raised her hands as if in blessing, and then vanished into the wind. Perhaps it was only imagination, or perhaps heaven was returning what the world had forgotten. And somewhere between silence and song, her story still drifts, the story of Salome, the sister who vanished yet never truly left. The wind carried her story long after her body was gone. In the villages by the sea, in the valleys where shepherds still hummed old psalms to the dawn, they spoke of her in fragments, never as a legend but as a remembrance, like the faint trace of incense after prayer. Some said that her spirit lingered near the wells and olive groves, walking where her brother once walked. Others said she appeared only to those who had forgotten what hope felt like. A woman bowed by grief would wake from sleep to find the scent of myrrh in the room and a whisper in her ear, "He has not left you." Then silence, pure and endless. There were a few who swore they saw her during the persecutions, tending to the wounded after the soldiers had gone. She never spoke, but her presence steadied trembling hands. One soldier, struck by shame, fell to his knees before her and said, "Forgive me, for I do not know who I serve." She touched his forehead and replied, "Then begin by serving peace." When he looked up, she was gone. No one knew how many years she lived. Some thought she could not die at all, that she had been taken into the light, the way a flame is absorbed by dawn. Others believed she simply faded step by step until she became what she had always been, a song without a singer, a light without a source. But even fading can be holy. Even vanishing can be a form of worship. If you listen closely, her silence still speaks. It tells of a world that needed her brother's fire, but also her stillness. It reminds those who seek heaven in miracles that sometimes heaven hides in gentleness, in a mother's patience, in a daughter's hands, in a sister's quiet faith. Mary lived long enough to hear the rumors of her daughter's disappearance. Some said she wept, others said she smiled, as if recognizing a promise fulfilled. "She has gone where he has gone," she murmured to James, "and perhaps now they both walk among the stars." Years later, when James himself became a man of faith, the teacher, the guide, the one people would call the just, he spoke often of mercy, of faith that asks nothing in return. When someone asked him who first taught him such tenderness, he said softly, "A sister whose name you would not remember, though the world still breathes her kindness." And perhaps that is the true miracle, not that she lived or vanished or saw angels in her dreams, but that her spirit continued to move quietly through the centuries, unrecorded yet undying. Her story became part of the earth's own memory, carried in the lull between prayer and sleep. For every age gives birth to its forgotten ones, souls whose purpose is not to shine in history's fire but to tend its embers. Salome was one of them. Her brother brought light. She learned to keep it alive when the world turned cold. She was not the flame but the breath that guards it. And though her name may not echo through Scripture's halls, her silence built a bridge between the divine and the human, between the voices that preach and the hearts that simply live the truth. In that way, she never vanished. Because every act of unseen kindness, every quiet forgiveness, every tear shed without witness carries her echo. Every time a mother forgives her child, every time a stranger shares their last piece of bread, every time love chooses stillness over rage, she lives again. For holiness is not only found in the thunder of revelation. Sometimes it moves like wind through reeds, soft enough to be mistaken for ordinary breath. And so when the night grows long and the stars seem further than prayer, listen. You may hear it, the faint hum beneath the world's noise, the hymn that was never written but always remembered. It is her voice, the sister who vanished yet was never lost, the woman whose silence became the world's lullaby. And in that lullaby, heaven still speaks gently, endlessly, in the tongue of love that needs no name. When empires crumble, stories remain. And when stories fade, only blood remembers. Long after the cross had darkened the hill and the veil of the temple had torn, the quiet lineage of the Holy Family scattered like seeds in the wind. Some went east, carrying nothing but their names and the memory of a voice that once called the dead to rise. Others vanished into the folds of new lands, their faces forgotten but their hearts still burning with the rhythm of his breath. The world had begun to tremble under the weight of its own forgetting. Kingdoms fought to own the name of the Messiah, turning his mercy into gold and his silence into law. The empire that once crucified him now built temples in his honor, and yet the air beneath those stones felt hollow. For those who had truly known him, his mother, his brothers, his sister who vanished into light, the truth could not be contained in crowns or creeds. It lived on quietly, through the veins of their descendants, hidden in prayer and patience. James, the brother they called the just, became a shepherd of the scattered faithful. In Jerusalem, he led not through power, but through gentleness. He was said to pray until his knees hardened like stone. His followers whispered that when he spoke of heaven, the birds grew still. But prophecy carries its own sorrow, for the same city that once crowned his brother with thorns would not suffer James to live long. He was cast down from the temple steps, martyred by the same blindness that once crucified mercy itself. Before his death, though, he left behind a single promise not written in ink but spoken to those who carried his trust. "The light does not end with us," he said. "It moves as breath moves, unseen yet eternal. The bloodline is not flesh but flame." And so they carried it, not as royalty carries jewels, but as shepherds carry fire through the night. Some fled to the deserts of Arabia, where the stars burned so near that the heavens felt close enough to touch. Others traveled north, beyond the rivers of Damascus, where they built small sanctuaries in caves carved by wind. Among them was a woman, the daughter of James, though her name is lost. She was said to have eyes like dusk and hands that healed by touch alone. Her prayers were wordless, yet mountains seemed to breathe when she knelt. It is written in an old Syriac fragment that she spoke of her uncle, the Messiah, not as a god distant from mankind, but as a brother who had taught her ancestors how to love the world enough to suffer for it. Generations passed. The empire fell and rose again under new names. Yet the bloodline endured, not royal, not rich, but luminous in its simplicity. They lived as teachers, mystics, and wanderers. They never claimed the title holy. They only lived as though heaven were always one breath away. In the highlands of Persia, a family of carpenters told stories of a forefather who once built a cradle for a king born without a crown. In Arabia, a small tribe whispered of a woman who healed by silence, her lineage traced to a man who had spoken peace to the storm. And in Egypt, along the Nile's slow curve, monks recorded the tale of the House of the Morning, a family said to carry the breath of Issa, the one they called the Spirit of God. All these threads formed a tapestry unseen, a lineage woven not by power, but by remembrance. They never sought recognition. To claim his blood was to carry his burden, to live quietly, to love endlessly, to forgive beyond measure. For them, lineage was not proof of greatness, but a responsibility to keep light alive where darkness sought to reign. And so, while kings built cathedrals, the true inheritors of the light built silence. They taught their children that the divine does not dwell in stone, but in mercy. They prayed not to be seen, but to keep seeing, to look upon the world with the same eyes their ancestors once turned toward the broken. Even now, in the forgotten corners of the earth, there may be those who descend from that quiet line not by flesh but by faith. They wake with peace in their bones, speak kindness without thought, and carry within them a calm that feels ancient. They do not know why, but heaven does. For the bloodline of the light was never meant to be found, only felt. As the centuries turned, the memory of the Holy Family became a legend whispered among wanderers and mystics. The world divided itself into empires and faiths, each claiming the light as its own, each reshaping his words into the language of power. But far from palaces and cathedrals, the true inheritance of his mercy continued in silence, passed hand to hand, heart to heart, through those whose lives still echoed the tenderness of Nazareth. In the deserts of the East, where the wind carved stories into the sand, small brotherhoods of prayer began to rise. They did not call themselves disciples, nor saints, nor heirs. They called themselves keepers of the breath. They believed that the divine voice, the same breath that had stirred life into dust, still moved through their lineage, guiding them through dreams and silence. At night they gathered in caves lit only by oil lamps and sang verses that no one wrote down. Their words drifted upward like smoke, carrying the ancient promise. The light is never lost, it only hides within the faithful. Further west, beyond the mountains of Judea, an old man kept a scroll hidden beneath his bed. It contained the names of families said to descend from the brothers of the Messiah, James, Hoseas, Simon, and Judas. Yet the ink had faded, and the parchment itself was nearly dust. He never showed it to anyone, for he feared what kings would do if they discovered that heaven's blood still walked the earth. When he died, the scroll was burned with him, the ashes scattered into the wind, a fitting burial for a secret too sacred to be claimed. There were rumors, too, among the scholars of Alexandria, of a sect called the Children of the Morning. They believed the spirit of the Messiah flowed not through blood alone, but through remembrance. They taught that whoever lives with the same love he carried becomes kin in spirit, and thus part of the eternal family. To them, the true bloodline was invisible, written in mercy rather than flesh. In time, these two lines, the one of blood and the one of heart, began to intertwine, until even heaven could not tell them apart. The descendants of his house walked among shepherds, poets, and travelers. Some were poor, some learned, some nameless, but all carried the same quiet flame, a peace that lingered even in suffering. One tale tells of a child born in the Syrian hills during a time of war. His mother, before dying, whispered a single prayer into his ear. "Remember the name that means peace." That child grew to heal the wounded with his touch and feed the hungry from his own store. He never claimed to be holy, but those who met him said they could feel something ancient in his presence, a stillness that reminded them of the Messiah himself. Another story, told in Persia, speaks of a young woman who wept beneath the stars, asking God if the line of her ancestor would ever be known again. That night she dreamt of a man clothed in light who said, "The world will never trace my blood, for it flows where faith abides. The bloodline is not of flesh, but of remembrance. You are not forgot." When she awoke, her tears had dried and her heart was calm. And so it was generation after generation that the bloodline of the light continued not in royal halls, but in the quiet corners of devotion. It was carried by those who mended wounds, who forgave when the world demanded vengeance, who saw God in the eyes of the broken. If you were to ask heaven to show you this lineage, it would not point to kings or priests. It would point to mothers who pray for their children in silence, to wanderers who feed strangers, to dreamers who speak truth even when no one listens. For the light never sought lineage to preserve its name. It sought lineage to preserve its nature. And that nature, humble, merciful, infinite, became the true inheritance of all who remember. Even now, perhaps, someone reading these words carries a trace of that same light, not in blood, but in spirit. And the heavens, looking down, whisper gently, "Still mine." As the ages deepened and kingdoms faded into dust, the line of light continued its quiet pilgrimage through the veins of humanity. It did not wear crowns nor write decrees. It lived in the unseen, in the breath of prayer before dawn, in the hand that lifted the fallen, in the voice that forgave when justice could not. The world no longer spoke their names, yet their gentleness shaped history like water carving stone. Somewhere in the highlands of Armenia, a monastery still tells of a child born under a star that moved against the sky. The monks called him Ishil, the echo of peace. He grew among them, never knowing his origin. But when he spoke, his words were the same that once stirred fishermen and kings alike. Blessed are the merciful. He would leave food by the door of the sick, whisper comfort to animals, and disappear into the hills for days to pray. When he died, they said the air smelled of cedar and honey. The monks carved on his stone. He remembered. In another century, when the desert kingdoms rose and fell like waves, a woman known only as Miriam the Wayfarer walked the roads of Egypt. She wore a veil as white as salt and carried no belongings but a staff and a flask of water. When asked who she was, she would answer, "A daughter of silence." Some said she descended from the holy kin of Nazareth, others that she was merely a spirit of the desert. But when she prayed, even the sand seemed to still. She was last seen walking into the setting sun, leaving behind footprints that glowed faintly in the dark, as if the light within her refused to die. Such stories multiply through time, fragments of grace hidden inside the folds of forgotten generations. Every few centuries, someone would appear who spoke with that same calm authority, who healed with compassion instead of command, who carried peace as though it were inheritance. The scholars argued, the empires denied, but heaven smiled, knowing the bloodline of the light was not bound by genealogy. It was the quiet persistence of love. In the scrolls of Damascus there is a verse, unsigned, written in the same tone as the ancient Gospels. The house of the blessed does not live in one nation or name. It walks where the broken cry for mercy and rests where forgiveness is remembered. Perhaps that verse was written by one of them, one who understood that divinity's truest legacy is not glory, but gentleness. For those who still carried his light, life was not easy. They were wanderers, misunderstood, often hunted by those who mistook peace for rebellion. Some lived among scholars, disguising their wisdom in parables. Others tilled the soil in silence, letting their prayers fall like rain upon the earth. They never sought recognition. They sought remembrance not of themselves, but of the presence that once walked barefoot through Galilee. Even in our time, when the world hums with the noise of machines and the forgetting of souls, that same bloodline stirs. It may be sleeping in those who speak kindness without reason, in those who love without calculation, in those who forgive without name. The light does not choose the powerful, it chooses the pure of heart, the ones who carry silence as strength. And when the stars tremble and the age of remembrance dawns again, the true heirs will rise not with banners or crowns, but with the same words he once spoke to the wind. Peace be upon you. For the promise has never changed. It is written not in parchment but in pulse, not in scripture but in soul. Every child born with the instinct to heal, every mother who chooses mercy, every stranger who offers shelter, they are the continuation of that divine line. Perhaps it has always been this way, the light dividing itself endlessly, so that no corner of the earth is ever without its warmth. Perhaps you, even now, carry a fragment of that inheritance without knowing. The story of the Holy Family did not end at the tomb. It scattered into humanity like seeds into soil, buried, forgotten, yet destined to bloom wherever compassion takes root. And when the world grows cold again, as it always does, the light will return through its children, not in thunder, but in tenderness. For the bloodline of the light was never meant to rule. It was meant to remind me. Before the empires carved their faith into stone, before councils debated what truth should sound like, there was another voice, quiet, unguarded, written in dust and devotion. It belonged to James, the brother of the Messiah, the one they called the just. His gospel was not of thunder or miracle, but of gentleness, a path of faith walked barefoot through the ordinary. James had lived beside the light and learned that holiness is not an act, but a way of breathing. After the crucifixion, when others fled or built temples of argument, he remained. He tended to the poor, comforted widows, and prayed in the same silence his brother once carried. Those who followed him said that when he knelt, even the earth grew still. The Gospel of James was not meant to challenge or divide. It was a letter written to the heart, a reminder that the kingdom of God does not begin in heaven, but in the small mercies of men. He spoke of faith not as a banner, but as a seed. "Do not worship the light from afar," he wrote, "but become the lamp that holds it." Few ever saw the full text. It was hidden by time and by fear, copied in secret by those who treasured simplicity more than dogma. For in the growing power of empires, humility became dangerous. The rulers of faith desired obedience, not tenderness. But James spoke of freedom, the freedom of the soul to choose love when law demanded division. He wrote, "Pure devotion is not in sacrifice or in speech, but in care for the broken, in love that leaves no trace." Those words were whispered in the streets of Jerusalem long after his death. They passed from lips to lips like prayer, surviving persecution, carried by travelers who refused to let mercy die. Some said his gospel was buried with him beneath the temple steps. Others believed it was carried east, hidden within the scrolls of mystics who wandered the deserts of Syria. One fragment that endures, preserved in a monastery beside the Euphrates, speaks of a vision James saw on the night before his death. He dreamt of his brother not upon the cross, but walking among fields of light. "The world will wound itself with my name," the Messiah said, "but do not despair. Each wound will one day bloom with forgiveness." When James awoke, he wept not from fear, but from recognition. He understood then that the gospel he carried was not a scripture of conquest, but of remembrance. His task was not to convert, but to console. To remind mankind that salvation is not a crown placed upon the head, it is a gentleness reborn in the heart. And so he continued, day by day, to walk the narrow road between faith and empire. His followers gathered around him in the marketplaces, in caves, and in the shadows of temples that no longer remembered their purpose. He taught them to greet each other not with doctrine, but with peace. He asked them to keep no record of miracles, only of kindness. Once, when asked what truth was, James answered, "Truth is not what divides the wise. It is what makes a child feel safe." It is said that when he prayed, a faint light would surround him, not the blinding fire of prophets, but the quiet shimmer of dawn before the sun. His words, like his brother, carried the scent of eternity wrapped in human warmth. Yet, as his influence grew, so too did the fear of those who governed the faith. They could not control a man who bowed to no power but love. And so they silenced him. He was thrown from the temple, struck, and left beneath the stones that once echoed with his prayers. But even as his body faded, his voice did not. Somewhere, hidden among lost scrolls and whispered dreams, the Gospel of James still breathes not as a relic, but as a living rhythm. It speaks through every act of compassion, every tear forgiven, every humble hand that reaches toward the broken. For though the empire erased his words from parchment, it could not erase them from the soul of mankind. And those who still listen in silence will hear it, the gospel not of power but of peace. The years following James's death were filled with quiet unrest. The world was changing, kingdoms shifted, faith hardened, and men began to argue about the very face of mercy. Yet in the midst of that noise, a few still carried the memory of his voice, the soft, deliberate tone that could calm the most fevered hearts. They met in secret places, in candle-lit rooms behind markets, in the hollow silence of old gardens, in caves by the sea where the wind sounded like distant prayer. They called themselves the keepers of the path, though they claimed no banner, no doctrine, no priesthood. Their only scripture was a single phrase that James had once spoken. The kingdom is found where love is practiced, not where it is preached. These were the guardians of the hidden gospel. They carried no copies of it, for the words lived within them. Each would remember a verse, a story, a fragment, and together, through their gatherings, the gospel lived like breath moving from mouth to mouth. It was a gospel of humility and awe, a reminder that divine truth could fit inside the smallest act of compassion. Among these keepers was a woman named Damaris, once a servant in the city of Tyre. She had seen cruelty her whole life, but the teachings of James transformed her. To forgive, she told the children she taught, is to create space for God to rest. They said that when she died, her last words were, "He still walks among us in mercy's shadow." Centuries later, travelers from the East would speak of Damaris and her kind with wonder. Some said their bones glowed faintly beneath the earth, as if light itself refused to leave them. Others believed that their prayers became the foundation of the desert monasteries, the quiet hearts of faith untouched by empire. The gospel they carried spoke of holiness in smallness. James had written, "Do not look for heaven in the thrones of men, for it sits instead upon the mat of the weary, the table of the poor." This was the heart of his teaching, that faith is not spectacle but surrender. But in the grand cities, this message was not welcome. Scholars debated what God's favor should look like. Rulers crowned themselves as divine. And when the words of James resurfaced, they called them dangerous, too gentle to rule, too merciful to control. The fragments that survived were hidden again, folded into prayers disguised as poetry. A verse would appear in a hymn. A line would hide in a lullaby sung by mothers who had never read a scroll in their lives. And so, through music and memory, the hidden gospel endured, untouched by greed, safe within the cradle of ordinary hearts. It is said that one monk, centuries later, found a portion of this lost text carved faintly into the back of a wooden icon. The words were nearly erased by time, but he traced them carefully with his hand until he could read them in the candlelight. "When you look upon the poor, see your own reflection. When you see your enemy, bless the breath that sustains him, for there are no strangers in the house of the light." The monk wept. He copied those lines onto parchment and sealed them inside the wall of his cell. He wrote in his journal, "If this be heresy, then let me remain a heretic of love." Time, as always, swallowed both the monk and his words, but some truths are too patient to die. They wait beneath ruins, beneath centuries, until hearts become quiet enough to hear them again. The gospel of James is not lost, it is merely asleep. It lives in every act of gentleness, every moment where judgment yields to mercy. It breathes in the silence of those who choose kindness when the world demands cruelty. And if you listen closely, in the hush before prayer, in the pause between heartbeats, you may still hear it. The faint echo of a brother's devotion, the rhythm of a love that needed no temple. For the words of the just one were never meant to fill libraries. They were meant to fill lives. In the end, the story of the hidden gospel is not about lost pages. It is about remembered truth. Every fragment that slipped through the fingers of time became a seed planted in human hearts, and like all living things, the seeds waited for the right season to bloom. There are whispers that, centuries after James's death, a copy of his writings reached the valleys of Mesopotamia. A band of travelers, neither priests nor scholars, but simple craftsmen, carried it in a clay jar wrapped in linen. They read from it only at night, by the dim glow of oil lamps, and never allowed to outsiders. The words, they said, were alive, not to be displayed, but to be absorbed. One of those travelers, an old man named Elyon, wrote in his diary before his death, "I have read the book of the just. It speaks not to the mind, but to the soul's marrow. It says the world will know the truth again when men cease trying to own it." After his death, the jar was sealed in a wall of an abandoned temple. Centuries later, when the earth shook and the stones cracked, the jar broke, scattering its contents into the dust. Pilgrims who came afterward found only fragments, their letters faded, their meaning scattered, but they felt peace in the ruin, as if the silence itself still carried the voice of the just. Some fragments survived. They spoke of a faith that did not belong to altars or robes, but to the heart's simple decency. The prayer that pleases heaven most, James wrote, is the kindness that needs no witness. In those few words, the essence of his gospel shines clearer than any sermon. For while others sought to bind truth in doctrine, James sought to set it free in compassion. His was not a religion of walls, but of windows wide open to the wind of divine mercy. It is said that during one long winter, a monk in Antioch dreamed of a man clothed in light. The man said, "My brother wrote of what the world feared most, that God is not distant. He walks wherever you love without reason." When the monk awoke, he found a verse written in the frost on his window pane. He copied it before it melted, though the source was unknown. Faith is not belief in what is unseen. It is tenderness toward what is before you. This, too, became part of the legend, the living proof that the Gospel of James continued to breathe, even when its words had vanished. The followers of the just began to fade from history as empires tightened their grip on belief. Yet, hidden in the quiet corners of monasteries and the lullabies of mothers, the tone of James's teaching endured. The world may forget words, but it never forgets how love feels. And so, through centuries of forgetting, the message remained alive. It resurfaced in poets who spoke of humility, in mystics who heard God in silence, in the nameless good that moves unseen through the centuries. The gospel was no longer bound to a name. It had become the heartbeat of mercy itself. Perhaps this was how James had intended it. For what good is a scripture if it remains trapped in parchment, guarded by fear? His brother had taught that the kingdom of God was within, and James had answered that the temple of that kingdom was the act of kindness itself. Together, their teachings formed a circle, heaven teaching earth how to forgive, and earth teaching heaven how to endure. And so the hidden gospel lives not in archives, but in every life that chooses compassion over cruelty. Somewhere, a child helps a stranger without being told. Somewhere, an old woman forgives a friend who wronged her. Somewhere, someone prays not for miracles, but for peace. In those moments, the pages of James's gospel turn once more. For what was written on stone will crumble. What was written on hearts will remain. And long after the empires of faith are dust, the hidden words of the just will still whisper, soft as breath, eternal as dawn. Love quietly. It is the loudest sermon of all. The light that began in Nazareth was pure when it rose, but by the time it reached the palaces of men, it had already begun to fracture. For every prophet, there comes a moment when truth meets empire, and one of them must bow. The empire did not begin as evil. It began as fear disguised as order. Rome had conquered the world, but it could not conquer death. When it heard the whisper of resurrection, it trembled. Power, you see, cannot tolerate a kingdom built without walls. And so it did what all empires do, it turned revelation into rule. At first it was subtle. The teachings of the Messiah spread quietly through streets and markets, carried by fishermen and mothers, by slaves and dreamers. The words were simple: love your enemy, forgive the unforgivable, give without expecting. But simplicity is the language of heaven, and the world has always preferred laws written in stone. By the third generation after his death, the empire began to see that it could not kill his message. It could only claim it. Temples rose where silence once taught. Councils gathered, deciding which memories were allowed to live and which must be forgotten. The Gospel of James, the words of Mary, the stories of the sister who vanished, all were deemed inconvenient. The empire preferred the Christ of crowns, not the one who washed feet. And so began the rewriting of heaven. Scrolls that spoke of tenderness were sealed. Texts that spoke of equality were burned. The poor who had once been called blessed were told to obey. The divine was lifted higher and higher until no hand could reach it. Where once he had said, "The kingdom is within you," the empire replied, "The kingdom is ours to give." James's followers, the keepers of the path, were scattered. Some were hunted, some converted, others vanished into deserts where the sound of prayer could still be trusted. Yet even in exile they remembered. They carried the true light as embers under their cloaks, waiting for the wind of mercy to return. Mary lived long enough to see the empire raise monuments to her son. Marble and gold adorned his name, but she could see the hollowness beneath the shine. She once told a disciple, "You cannot build heaven from stone. It lives only in the heart that forgives." The disciple wrote her words down, but his scroll, too, disappeared, hidden or destroyed, no one knows. The first great churches became echoes of the empire itself, structured, ordered, filled with rituals that imitated reverence but lacked remembrance. Men spoke of salvation, but their hands remained clean of suffering. The same soldiers who had once mocked her son now bowed before his image, not out of faith, but out of fear of losing power. Yet beneath the marble, something still breathed. In secret places, the humble gathered, the descendants of the light, the quiet inheritors of the sacred fire. They prayed not to statues, but to the living silence that had once walked among them. They remembered the simplicity of his words, the rhythm of his breath. They passed it on through stories whispered over bread, through kindnesses done in secret. The empire, in its pride, could not see that every time it silenced one truth, 10 more were born in the shadows. For light cannot be owned, it escapes through cracks, it glows in ruins, it hides in the breath of children. And so, the faith that was once a fire became two things at once, a throne and a whisper. The throne ruled the world, but the whisper ruled the soul. Even now, centuries later, that pattern remains. Every empire of belief repeats the same mistake, mistaking holiness for hierarchy, forgetting that the divine was never meant to be caged in crowns or cathedrals. The shadow of the empire still stretches across the centuries, but wherever there is shadow, there is also the quiet defiance of light. And in that light, fragile, hidden, eternal, the true kingdom continues to grow, unrecorded, unstoppable. When truth becomes power, it forgets how to kneel. In the generations that followed, the empire cloaked itself in holiness. Bishops walked where soldiers once marched. Crosses replaced spears, yet the eyes behind them looked the same. The message of mercy that once flowed freely through fields and fishermen's boats was now recited in halls of marble. The empire learned how to speak of heaven without ever listening to it. They dressed the Messiah in gold, placed him upon altars, and called it reverence, forgetting that he had walked barefoot, that he had touched the unclean, that he had fed the poor with his own hands. They carved his suffering into stone and called it victory, though victory had never been his desire. He had not come to rule men, but to teach them to love one another. But the empire could not understand love without control, nor faith without fear. The keepers of the path watched in sorrow. They lived in the mountains and deserts, far from the cities, preserving what the empire tried to erase. They whispered the names of Mary and James, of the sister who vanished, of the Holy Family who lived not for conquest but for compassion. To them, holiness was not found in conquest, but in kindness that endured humiliation. The empire can build its temples, they would say, but it cannot build a single humble heart. One of these keepers, a man named Elyon, wrote a letter that still survives in fragments. He said, "The empire believes the throne of God is made of gold, but I have seen it. It is made of tears and forgiveness." Theophan's words spread quietly among peasants and wanderers. They carried them as hidden prayers, recited not in churches but in the open air, in the marketplaces, among shepherds, in the whisper of wind through olive trees. Wherever the empire's banners flew, those who remembered the original light met beneath the stars instead. It was in this time that new scholars arose, philosophers who had never met the Messiah, yet claimed to define him. They wrote creeds and decrees, building fences around eternity. Those who disagreed were silenced, not by reason but by flame. The same empire that once crucified him now crucified his likeness through words and wars. But heaven, too, has its quiet rebellions. In the deserts of Sinai, women prophets began to write again. They recorded visions, dreams of the Messiah walking through ruined cities, his face turned not toward kings but toward children. One vision told of his return not to temples, but to a marketplace where beggars sat. He bent down, washing their feet as he had done once before, and said, "My house was never built with stone." These writings were banned, branded heresy, and hidden. Yet some copies survived buried in jars, sewn into robes, or memorized by those too poor to write. They were passed down like lullabies, never recorded in any council or creed, but carried within the bloodstream of faith itself. Centuries turned. New empires rose from the ashes of the old. Each one built its own image of God, each one shaped the divine into the mold of its power. But through all the centuries of conquest, the same quiet light endured, unowned, unbroken, unending. In small monasteries and silent cells, monks and mystics remembered the older voice, the one that said, "The kingdom is within you." They lived simply, fed the hungry, healed the sick, and prayed without asking for reward. They did not seek heaven in conquest, but in compassion. And so they kept alive the only rebellion heaven ever approved of, the rebellion of mercy against fear. And when night fell over the empire, as it always does, the temples of stone crumbled, the banners faded, and the golden crowns rusted. But in a humble house somewhere, in a child's bedtime prayer, in a widow's whispered blessing, in the quiet forgiveness of one soul toward another, the light of Nazareth still burned. For empires fall, and doctrines break, but love does not. The shadow cannot consume what was born of light. And though the empire thought it owned heaven, heaven had already returned to the hearts of those who never sought to rule it. For the divine was never meant to sit on a throne, it was meant to sit beside you. Every empire fears what it cannot control. And though the rulers of faith wore the symbols of the cross, they trembled before the silence that once spoke through the carpenter's son. For silence cannot be taxed, it cannot be commanded. It answers only to the wind. As centuries passed, the faith of empires became a theater of crowns and incense. In cathedrals of marble, men sang to heaven but could no longer hear it. They spoke his name in hundreds of languages, yet forgot the tone of his gentleness. Where once he had said, "Blessed are the meek," they now proclaimed, "Blessed are the mighty." And so the light that began as a whisper in Nazareth became divided, half imprisoned in gold, half hidden among the poor. But heaven, in its quiet patience, has always chosen the poor as its messengers. While kings quarreled over doctrine, widows shared bread in his name. While bishops debated power, shepherds still prayed as their ancestors did, barefoot beneath the stars. The empire's scrolls recorded battles and councils, but heaven's scrolls recorded small mercies. The nurse who tended the dying, the prisoner who forgave his captor, the mother who taught her child to love without condition. And thus the true gospel continued, unwritten, ungoverned, unstoppable. Among the ruins of the empire, mystics began to rise like flowers through stone. Some were monks, others hermits, some simple wanderers who carried only the memory of love as their scripture. They spoke of a faith that needed no crowns, no intermediaries, only awareness. The divine, they said, is closer than your own breath. These were the descendants of the hidden bloodline, not by birth, but by remembrance. They had inherited the forgotten tenderness of Mary, the patient silence of James, the vanishing grace of the sister who disappeared. They lived as if the kingdom were already here, and in their lives it was. But empires never die quietly. Each age found a new way to clothe power in holiness. The light was rewritten, again and again, until its edges blurred. Scholars argued over what his words truly meant, though the meaning had never been complicated. Forgive, love, remember. Still, there were always a few, the quiet ones, the wanderers, the keepers of the still flame, who refused to let the simplicity die. In every century, they appeared like lanterns in fog. They taught without teaching, healed without claiming, prayed without an audience. And each time they appeared, the empire trembled, because their existence proved that truth could live outside its walls. One such keeper in the twilight of Rome's power wrote, "The shadow of the empire is long, but light does not fear it. For shadow is born only where light still shines." Those words became a secret mantra among the scattered faithful. They would whisper it to one another in passing, in markets, in monasteries, in prisons. The phrase was not rebellion, it was remembrance. A reminder that the empire's throne was built on sand, but mercy was eternal. When the last emperor of the West fell, the faithful thought the world would end. But the world does not end, it renews. From the ashes of conquest rose new languages of praise, new ways of remembering. The faces changed, but the same eternal truth remained, that no crown could contain love, and no empire could silence light. In time, the story of the Messiah's family faded from the public tongue. Their names were buried beneath centuries of conquest and creed. But every so often, a pilgrim or a poet or a child would dream of a humble home in Nazareth, a mother by the fire, a carpenter shaping wood, a boy whose eyes reflected eternity. They would wake weeping, though they did not know why. Perhaps heaven allows such dreams so that the world never forgets where holiness truly began. Not in marble, not in throne rooms, but in silence, in the hush of a small home, where love was first taught not as law but as life. And though empires rise still, building towers and doctrines, laws and emblems, the same voice continues to breathe beneath their noise. The kingdom is within you. And so long as that whisper remains, no empire can ever win. When the empire's crowns began to tarnish and the marble temples echoed with emptiness, the true heirs of the light walked quietly out into the world. They carried no banners, no proof of lineage, only the memory of peace. They were the forgotten children of a forgotten house, yet wherever they went the air changed, as if the earth itself recognized its kin. They called themselves nothing. They wore no marks of holiness. To strangers they looked like travelers, traders, shepherds, healers, teachers. But within them lived the pulse of the sacred family, not by blood alone, but by the inheritance of mercy. They carried the rhythm of Nazareth in their bones, the calm of Mary, the silence of James, the gentleness of the carpenter, and the fire of the sister who vanished. They walked through lands torn by war and drought, their faces weathered by the sun. In deserts they offered water before words. In cities they taught compassion to those who no longer believed it possible. They did not speak of destiny, only of kindness. When asked who they followed, they would say, "The wind." When asked what they believed, they would reply, "That love remembers." Their journey scattered them across continents. Some traveled east, following the trail of stars through Persia and India, carrying the message of inner stillness, that heaven dwells not in temples but in hearts made pure by compassion. Others journeyed south into Africa, where they wove the ancient words into songs that echoed through valleys like prayer. A few moved north into the mountains of Europe, where they hid from kings and scholars who would call them heretics. Yet in every place they touched, kindness took root like spring grass after frost. They were not missionaries, they were mirrors. When people looked upon them, they saw the reflection of the goodness they had forgotten within themselves. That was their gift, to awaken remembrance without command. The wandering heirs of the light did not seek to convert, they sought to remind. For they knew that faith cannot be given, only remembered. Among them was a woman known only as Leora, whose name meant light. She wandered from village to village with nothing but a wooden staff and a cloth pouch. The sick called her healer, though she used no medicine. Her cure was presence, the unspoken assurance that one was seen, known, and still loved. When a child once asked how she prayed, she smiled and said, "By listening until the silence answers." Another of the heirs, a man named Onan, carried with him a single book, blank except for one page. On it were written 7 words, "Love those who do not deserve it." He would show it to strangers, then close it, saying, "This is the whole gospel, the rest is commentary." For generations, these wanderers moved unseen beneath history's gaze. Empires fell, New religions rose, languages changed, yet their spirit endured. Sometimes they gathered, guided by dreams, strangers meeting at crossroads as if drawn by the same invisible star. They would share bread, silence, and the old stories, the ones never written down, the ones remembered only by the heart. Then, as quietly as they came, they would part again, leaving behind nothing but peace. The world never recognized them. Kings passed them on the road without notice. Scholars never recorded their names. But wherever famine struck or fear spread, the heirs appeared like rain upon dry earth. They rebuilt not nations but hope, and though they called themselves wanderers, the truth is simpler. They were carrying the home of Nazareth wherever they went. For that home had never been a place. It had been a way of being, the stillness that believes, the humility that heals, the light that forgives. Even now, when the roads are paved and the sky hums with metal, the wandering heirs still walk among us. They are the ones who speak softly in a loud world, who choose mercy when anger seems easier, who forgive even when no one asks. They are not saints, they are reminders. And the earth, weary with forgetting, still needs their quiet footsteps. For the light that once lived in one man's heart was never meant to stay in one place. It learned to walk, and it never stopped. They moved like whispers through the centuries, leaving no footprints that history could claim. The wandering heirs did not seek recognition, for they knew the moment a name becomes famous, the heart begins to forget why it was chosen. Their pilgrimage was not toward a destination, but toward remembrance, a return to the stillness from which the light was first born. There was a saying among them, "To walk is to pray." And so they walked through deserts and jungles, through storms and ruins, through cities where men built towers to heaven and forgot the ground beneath their feet. They walked with patience, for patience was their scripture. Each step was a verse, each breath a hymn. In the highlands of Ethiopia, a man named Zerah carried the memory of the hidden gospel. He spoke of James not as a saint, but as a brother of the earth, one who taught that mercy was stronger than empire. The people listened, not because of his eloquence, but because of his gentleness. He mended sandals for the poor, repaired wells for travelers, and never asked for coins. "The world," he said, "is healed not by prophets, but by those who remember to be kind." Far away along the Silk Road, another heir traveled under a different name. She was called Anara, a merchant's daughter who sold spices and medicines, yet her true trade was healing hearts. In every town she left behind a piece of wisdom, disguised as a story. One night, when asked what she believed, she replied, "That love is older than religion." Those who heard her words felt something stir inside, a quiet ache that felt like memory returning after a long sleep. In the north, among the mountains cloaked in mist, there were others, monks who called themselves the children of the breath. They believed that the lineage of the light still flowed through humankind, not as blood, but as spirit. They prayed without words, believing that silence was the only language God still fully understood. Their temples were not built of stone, but of wind and sky. And sometimes, in the stillness between prayer and dawn, they would feel a warmth in the air, faint, familiar. "The family walks among us," they would whisper. "Their journey has not ended." But the world had begun to forget again. The new rulers built cathedrals and empires of scripture, turning faith into law and love into ornament. The heirs wandered unseen through lands now consumed by conquest. They saw men preach peace with swords and kings build temples with blood. And though their hearts grieved, they did not despair. They knew light must sometimes pass through shadow to be remembered. Among them was an old traveler named Iskander who wrote, "When I see cruelty rise again, I do not curse the darkness. I look for those still carrying water." He meant the heirs, those who carried mercy as the world burned. One winter, a famine swept through a vast kingdom. The rulers hoarded grain for themselves, and many perished. In that time the heirs appeared, gathering children, sharing what little they had. They did not perform miracles, only kindness. Yet by spring the famine lifted. Those who survived spoke of angels who wore rags. None of them realized they had met the descendants of a carpenter's house, the living echo of Nazareth. Generations passed. Empires fell once more. But the heirs endured, moving like the tide, retreating when the world grew loud, returning when it grew tired. They left no monuments, only gentleness. And so the story continued, unseen but unbroken, a sacred migration across centuries. Their path was the pulse of human goodness itself. Wherever there was compassion, forgiveness, or peace, the wandering heirs had passed that way. Sometimes they were mistaken for saints, sometimes for beggars. But to those with quiet eyes, they were neither. They were memory itself, the divine remembering what it once felt like to be human. Even now, in our modern age of noise and haste, they remain. You might see one sitting beside a dying stranger, holding their hand. You might meet one smiling at you on a crowded train, offering no sermon, only warmth. You might even be one, though you would never call yourself such. For the bloodline of the light was never about inheritance. It was about an invitation, and anyone who loves without reason has already accepted it. There are those who believe the heirs have vanished, that time itself has consumed their trail. But time does not devour what was born of eternity. It only hides it, so that the faithful must learn again how to see. The heirs never truly disappear. They change their faces, their languages, their clothes, but not their purpose. In every age they reawaken, carrying the same inheritance of peace. They arrive quietly, as they always have, in the hour when the world forgets what gentleness feels like. Once, during a season of endless wars, when kings and faiths devoured one another, the heirs gathered again, not in temples, but in a valley veiled with fog. There were 7 of them that night: a poet, a farmer, a child, a soldier, a widow, a healer, and a monk. None had met before, yet each had been called by the same dream, a dream of a home that no longer existed, a whisper of light that would not die. They sat around a small fire, and though no one spoke of lineage, all felt they were kin. The poet recited verses about love's surviving ruins. The farmer handed out bread made from his last harvest. The soldier laid down his sword and wept. And the monk, the oldest among them, said only this: the bloodline continues not through the veins, but through the vow to keep mercy alive when the world chooses power. When dawn came, they parted ways, never to see one another again. Yet from that valley, kindness began to bloom across lands once divided. It spread through markets, through villages, through the hearts of those who had long ago forgotten how to forgive. That is how the heirs worked, unseen, unnamed, unstoppable. In later centuries, rumors of them would rise like faint smoke. Sailors spoke of a man who walked upon the shore before storms, blessing the sea until the waves grew calm. Scholars wrote of an unnamed traveler who appeared in cities before wars, warning the people to remember compassion. And in small villages, mothers told their children stories of strangers who appeared when hope seemed lost, strangers whose eyes carried the same stillness that once lived in Galilee. But the world, restless and proud, forgot to listen. The heirs became myth, their memory reduced to parable. Yet even myths have roots, and those roots still reach into the soil of every heart that longs for peace. In truth, the heirs never sought to be found. To be found is to be confined. Their task has never been to prove that they exist, only to ensure that light does. For the divine lineage is not a relic of the past. It is a living current flowing through every soul willing to love without reward. When the first machines began to hum, when the sky filled with smoke and the earth with sorrow, some thought the sacred had finally left the world. But even then, the heirs remained. They appeared as nurses in hospitals, teachers in forgotten towns, friends who stay beside the suffering when all others leave. In the humblest acts of courage and tenderness, the same ancient pulse beats still, the heartbeat of Nazareth, quiet and eternal. A letter found in the desert centuries later, unsigned and undated, read, "I am no prophet, no saint. I am only the echo of one who loved without measure. I cannot perform miracles, but I can remain kind. And that is a miracle enough." Perhaps it was written by one of them. Perhaps it was written by you. Because the truth is simple. The light does not choose the perfect, it chooses the willing. Each generation has its heirs, those who bear the sacred without knowing, who rebuild the world one gentle act at a time. The more they are forgotten by history, the more they are remembered by heaven. So when you see kindness where cruelty should reign, when forgiveness appears where vengeance is deserved, when compassion stirs in the midst of despair, know that the wandering heirs have passed that way. For they walk still, through every age, unseen but not absent. They are the secret continuation of the sacred story, the living proof that love, once born, can never die. Every story that vanishes waits to be remembered. Every truth that falls into silence prepares for the moment it will rise again. So it was with the name of the Messiah's family, the blood that once walked beside divinity, buried under centuries of empire and forgetting. Yet names, like stars, do not die when they disappear. They only wait for the dark to become deep enough for their light to return. It began as whispers. Scholars dusting old manuscripts notice strange footnotes, faint, almost erased, speaking of brothers never mentioned, of a sister whose name was sung only in lullabies, of a lineage that never claimed its inheritance. In caves along the Dead Sea, among scrolls long hidden, fragments appeared, pieces of prayer written in the same hand as the early disciples. One fragment, brittle as breath, read simply, "He who carried light was not alone. His kin walked behind him unseen, keeping the flame from the wind." The world barely noticed at first, but remembrance is like fire. Once sparked, it spreads. In monasteries, in libraries, in the quiet hearts of those who still listened, the echoes of that forgotten family began to stir again. In the East, an old Sufi mystic named Rahman told his students, "Every prophet has a shadow." It is not darkness but memory, the proof that light once walked the earth. He spoke of the Holy Family not as relics but as living archetypes. They walk still, he said, but not in flesh. They walk in those who forgive, in those who serve, in those who love beyond reason. And across the sea in the west, a woman named Isolde dreamed the same dream each night, of a face she did not know, radiant yet sorrowful. A voice in her dream whispered, "Remember us." She began to write what she saw. Visions of Nazareth, of Mary in her twilight years, of the vanished sister walking through a field of gold. When she awoke, her heart would tremble as though she had touched eternity. These dreams, these fragments, these coincidences, they were the first stirrings of the lost name returning. For centuries, the empire had written only one version of holiness, male, distant, unapproachable. But memory has its own will, and it began to call from beneath the surface of time. The missing names, Mary's lineage, the brother's legacy, the sister's silence, all rose like dawn from beneath the ocean of forgetting. Humanity, weary from division, began to hunger again for a faith that could breathe. One scholar wrote, "It seems that history forgot the rest of the light." Another replied, "Perhaps the light never left. We simply stopped looking where it once shone." In small gatherings, people began to speak of the family as a symbol, not of ancestry, but of unity. The mother has compassion. The brothers have faith in action. The sister has silence that heals. Together they formed not a dynasty of rule, but a circle of remembrance. A pattern meant to be lived, not worshipped. Ancient texts began to surface, some genuine, some dreamed. They spoke of the house of the breath, a phrase once used by the earliest followers to describe the family. In that house, it was said, every soul was kin to God, for each breath was a reflection of the divine. And slowly, through art, song, and scripture reborn, the name returned not as one single revelation, but as a collective awakening. Humanity began to remember that holiness had always been shared, that divinity was not a throne, but a home. In a world grown tired of argument and fear, this return was like rain upon desert soil. People began to seek not the image of God in heaven, but the likeness of God in each other. The name that had been lost, the name that meant belonging, began to live again in the hearts of all who remembered. And perhaps that was always the plan. For what is forgotten must one day return, not to reclaim power, but to remind the world that love cannot be erased. And as the lost name began to rise from silence, heaven watched and whispered to the earth once more, "Be still, the family has returned." Names hold power, not because they are spoken, but because they are remembered. A forgotten name is like a locked gate in the soul, and when it is opened, light floods through. So it was in this age of rediscovery, a time when the ancient silence began to speak again, and the bloodline of the light rose not through flesh, but through memory. In the ruins of old monasteries, explorers uncovered fragments of hymns that had never been sung publicly. The words were written in an unfamiliar dialect, yet the rhythm was unmistakably sacred. One verse read, "From the womb of mercy came the flame, from the brothers came the breath, from the sister came the silence, and from the silence came the world." No scholar could trace its origin. It appeared in no record, no catalog, no church archive. And yet, the moment the words were read aloud, a stillness filled the air, as if the earth itself recognized its own song. The rediscovery of the Holy Family's memory did not come as a single revelation. It came as 1,000 small awakenings scattered across the globe. In deserts, in temples, in cathedrals, and beneath the endless noise of cities, people began to dream of the same quiet house, a place of peace, where the sacred and the human touched without boundary. Artists began painting the forgotten figures, not as myth or royalty, but as family. Mary, serene yet weary from love's long burden. James, stoic and humble with prayer-worn hands. The vanished sister, veiled in light, her eyes filled with both sorrow and serenity. These were not portraits of divinity above man, but of divinity among man, holiness that breathes, weeps, and forgives. And slowly, the stories that had been erased began to reassemble themselves. A group of scholars in Alexandria found a sealed jar buried beneath a ruined chapel. Inside were 6 parchments written in a soft, slanted script. They told of the years after the crucifixion, how Mary journeyed eastward, guided by visions of her son's light, accompanied by her surviving children and their children's children. How they sought not safety, but silence, believing that the world must forget them for truth to be reborn in its own time. One passage read, "We are not called to rule, but to remember. The blood of the light must wander until the world becomes gentle enough to receive it again." When the text was translated and shared, it spread like a forgotten melody returning to the human heart. Across nations, people began to weep without knowing why. Something within them, ancient, collective, sacred, stirred. It was not the rediscovery of a family, it was the rediscovery of belonging. Humanity began to remember that divinity was never a distant throne, but a shared inheritance. Every soul, every heart carried within it the same spark that had once lived in that small home in Nazareth. And so, the lost name returned not as a lineage, but as a language. People spoke it not with their mouths, but with their kindness. The name began to live again in how a stranger was fed, how a mother forgave, how the wounded were tended without question. The scholars called it the return of the lost name, but the mystics called it the awakening. For they knew the truth that heaven does not remember names as mortals do. It remembers hearts that mirror its own. In every act of compassion, the name of the family was spoken once more. When one forgave, the world whispered Mary. When one prayed for peace, the air murmured James. When one loved without reason, the silence sang Salome. And when one endured suffering with hope, heaven breathed Issa. Thus, the name returned not to books or temples, but to life itself. And those who listened closely began to understand. The story of the Messiah's family was never meant to end in history. It was meant to begin with us. For the divine does not vanish, it sleeps within humanity, waiting for those who are still enough to wake it. And when it wakes, the world remembers who it is. The forgotten name, the eternal family. The light was reborn through remembrance. It began to happen quietly, the way dawn returns after a long and sleepless night. No trumpet, no command, only a slow illumination spreading from one heart to another. The lost name, once sealed beneath centuries of empire and silence, began to breathe again through the people who were ready to remember. At first, they did not realize what was stirring within them. They only felt a strange tenderness, an ache that was not pain, a longing that was not sorrow. It came to those who prayed without words, who forgave without applause, who carried the burdens of others without speaking of their own. They began to live differently, more gently, as if guided by something older than thought. And the old mystics whispered, "The family has awakened within them." A poet in Andalusia wrote of it, "I have seen the house of light rebuilt in the eyes of the merciful. Its walls are made of silence, its roof of patience, and its door opens only for love." In distant lands, where no one had ever spoken the names of Mary or James, children began to dream of a shining home surrounded by olive trees. In the dream, a woman would smile and say, "Welcome home." They would wake weeping, though they did not know her face. Such is how heaven remembers, not through lineage, but through longing. The scholars tried to explain it. They said it was psychology, the collective memory of mankind. But mystics know what scholars forget, that heaven has its own ways of calling the soul back to its origin. And so, the lost name returned not as genealogy, but as consciousness. It moved through the hearts of those who had grown weary of division, through those who hungered for simplicity, through those who no longer believed in belonging yet still yearned to be seen. The family of light rose again, not of flesh, but of faith. It was never about discovering bloodlines or sacred relics. It was about remembering that the divine family was never just their story. It was ours. For when the light first walked among us, he did not come to create worshipers. He came to create kin. That was the secret the empires feared most, that the kingdom of heaven was not far above, but woven into every beating heart. That Mary's quiet endurance, James's steadfast faith, and the sisters' vanishing mercy were not holy exceptions. They were invitations. And when people began to live as if that invitation were real, the world began to change again. There were no grand revivals, no golden temples rising in their name. There were small things, neighbors reconciling, strangers feeding one another, enemies lowering their weapons. It happened in secret, the way spring creeps through frozen ground. Those who watched with worldly eyes saw nothing, but those who listened with the soul could hear the rustle of resurrection. In one ancient village, a man who had been blind since birth awoke one morning and said, "I dreamed of a woman dressed in blue light. She touched my eyes and said, 'Remember what you were made to see.'" When the villagers asked who she was, the man replied simply, "A mother." In that word, the lost name lived again. Every generation since has known some form of that awakening, moments when the world remembers its shared ancestry of light. Sometimes it appears in the compassion of a single person, sometimes in a movement that seeks peace over profit. Sometimes it comes as tears, sometimes as silence. But each time it comes, it carries the same whisper: "You were never forgotten." And perhaps that is the true return of the lost name, not the rediscovery of an ancient bloodline, but the reawakening of humanity's divine memory. For if the Holy Family was the seed of mercy, then all of creation is its garden. The family did not vanish into history. They dispersed, into you, into me, into every soul still capable of tenderness. And as long as love continues to bloom in unexpected places, the lost name is not lost at all. It is spoken every time a heart opens. It is remembered every time a soul forgives. It is reborn every time the world chooses light over fear. And so, the circle closes not with endings, but with awakening. The family of the Messiah never disappeared. They became the world itself. There are endings that are not endings, only transformations. The story of the Messiah's family does not close with death or distance. It unfolds like dawn, rising again in every generation that chooses tenderness over power. The light that once lived in Nazareth has never left the world. It only learned to move unseen, like breath, like prayer, like memory. The last chapter of this sacred remembering begins not in temples or tombs, but within you, the quiet space between heartbeat and breath where heaven still listens. For the light never belonged to history. It was always alive, waiting for remembrance to turn its face once more toward love. In the years after the empire fell, after the noise of doctrine quieted, the earth began to heal. The bones of war softened into dust, and new life pushed through forgotten ground. Travelers who wandered the desert spoke of strange warmth in the air, a peace that came without reason, a joy that required no proof. They called it the breath of Issa, the invisible remembrance of the one who had walked among men as both dust and divine. And it was said that wherever that breath passed, hearts became gentle again. In a small village near the river Jordan, an old woman tended a fig tree believed to have grown from the seed of the Holy Family's garden. She watered it every morning, whispering prayers she could barely remember. One dawn, as she touched its bark, she heard a voice in the wind. The tree remembers even when the world forgets. She fell to her knees and wept, not from sorrow but from recognition. The light was still here, not in relics or monuments, but in living things. For centuries, people had searched the heavens for signs of return. They waited for thunder, for miracles, for fire from the sky. But they did not understand. The light had never departed. It had simply entered every soul willing to carry it. The return of the Messiah was not to be an arrival, it was an awakening. The monks of Mount Arbel recorded a verse they claimed came to them in a dream. The world will not see me return in clouds, but in the eyes of those who forgive. The trumpet will sound not in the sky, but in the heart that remembers peace. And so, those who listened began to notice it, a quiet change moving through humankind. Strangers helping strangers. Enemies speaking gently. Children born with calmness in their eyes as if they had seen heaven before arriving here. These were the new bearers of the light, unknowing yet luminous. It became clear then that divinity had never been a visitor to the world, it was its native tongue. The earth itself carried memory. The rivers still sang the old names when the moon was high. The wind still whispered over the hills of Galilee, where a carpenter's hands once shaped both wood and destiny. And every time kindness bloomed where cruelty had ruled, it was as though that carpenter still breathed. The light cannot die, for it is not a thing. It is the first language of creation, the soundless song that existed before words. It was there when the universe began, and it will remain long after the last star burns out. The Holy Family was only its vessel, its reflection in human form. And through them, the world learned that even the infinite desired to be near, to feel hunger, to weep, to forgive. That nearness is an eternal miracle. The light that once healed with hands now heals through hearts. It feeds the hungry through strangers who share bread. It comforts the lonely through words spoken across oceans. It moves through us quietly, humbly, the way it once moved through them. For the kingdom they carried was not a realm to be entered, it was a way to see. To see God in the ordinary, to find heaven in the act of mercy. And when enough souls remember to see this way, the prophecy will fulfill itself without thunder or fear. The return of the light will no longer be awaited because it will be everywhere. It already is, for the light never left. It only changed its dwelling place from the sky to the soul. And even now it waits within you, patient as dawn, eternal as love. The light does not shout, it breathes. It does not demand to be seen, it invites you to notice. Long after the world thought it had buried holiness under progress and pride, the light remained hidden in the simplest gestures, in the smallest mercies that go unseen. The empire had fallen, the temples had faded, and still, a whisper persisted. I am here. It could be felt in the quiet moments between storms, in the pause before dawn, when the world holds its breath. It could be felt in the laughter of a child who forgives easily, or in the trembling hands of the old who still choose kindness. That was the light's new sanctuary, the unguarded heart. In one forgotten valley, a wanderer once asked a hermit, "Where has heaven gone? The world is dark again." The hermit smiled and replied, "Heaven did not go anywhere. You did, but it still waits for you." Then he pointed to the horizon where the first ray of morning touched the mountains and said, "There, that's how God knocks. It has always been this way." When the world grows cold, the light withdraws not in anger but in patience, waiting for love to become fertile ground again. When humanity begins to soften, when the noise begins to tire itself out, the light returns quietly, step by step, as if walking home. The return is happening now, not through prophets or kings, but through the quiet revolution of gentleness. Every small act of forgiveness is a sunrise. Every refusal to hate is a resurrection. The Messiah's family once carried that fire in their blood, and now it moves through every willing heart. It no longer belongs to one lineage, it belongs to the living. The mystics of the eastern deserts once wrote that the soul is a lamp, and God the flame that waits to enter it. They said, "The light is not missing from the world, it is missing from remembrance." And so they taught a single prayer, "Remember the light." They repeated it until it breathed itself. And those who prayed long enough began to see differently. The faces of strangers glowed. The wind seemed to hum. Even pain became a doorway, leading not to despair but to depth. The light was returning through awareness, and with it came a new understanding of faith, not belief in stories of the past, but participation in their continuation. The story of the Holy Family was never meant to be worshipped. It was meant to be lived again and again through every act of love that refuses to die. Even now, as cities roar and the earth trembles with unrest, the light continues its patient work. It hides in hospitals, in homes, in hearts that still choose tenderness. It lingers beside bedsides where forgiveness is whispered too late and yet still counts. It rests upon the shoulders of those who feed the hungry without question. A poet once said, "If the Messiah came again, he would come disguised as your own conscience." And perhaps he was right. For every time you choose peace when anger would feel easier, you are enacting his return. And when you look at the world and feel despair, remember, darkness is only the space where light has not yet been remembered. Every shadow proves that the light still exists somewhere nearby. The light that never left is not waiting for the world to become perfect. It waits for the world to become willing. And when it finds even one soul willing to listen, to truly listen, it enters without sound, without warning, without end. For the promise has always been this, that heaven would not remain distant, that divinity would dwell within dust, that the same breath which formed stars still moves within the human chest. So breathe. That is prayer enough. And when you exhale love into a loveless moment, the ancient house of Nazareth stands again, not in stone, but in spirit. The family returns. The promise lives. The light remembers itself through you. And the story, endless and eternal, continues not upward but inward until the heart becomes its own sunrise. When all stories have been told and all empires have turned to dust, what remains is not what was built, but what was believed. The story of the Holy Family, of the wandering heirs and the hidden gospels, of the forgotten names and remembered love, it was never meant to end with history. It was meant to end with peace. The light that never left is not a relic of the past. It is the quiet breath inside every living thing, the pulse that binds the seen and the unseen. When you close your eyes and feel that stillness, when the noise of the world falls away and only tenderness remains, that is the same presence that once walked the earth in human form. It has always been here. When a child forgives before they understand the word, the light moves. When two enemies embrace, when a stranger lifts another from the dust, when grief becomes gratitude, the light expands. It does not care for names or nations. It recognizes only compassion. There are nights when the stars seem closer, as if leaning down to listen. Those are the nights when heaven remembers how it once lived as flesh, and earth remembers how it once believed in miracles. In that remembering, the two worlds touch, and the light, eternal and familiar, passes between them once more. In one ancient story, too long forgotten, an old disciple asked heaven, Where did you go when the world turned cruel again? And heaven replied, I went nowhere. I simply became the hand that still fed the hungry. That is how the light endures, not as a vision to be worshipped, but as a choice repeated endlessly in small human ways. The kingdom of heaven, as it was first taught, was never a distant realm. It was a way of seeing, a lens through which the sacred becomes visible again in everything. And that sight still waits to be remembered. Look around you. The same breath that once spoke galaxies into being moved through the trees, the rivers, the people passing by. The air that filled the lungs of the Messiah now fills yours. The hands that healed through touch have multiplied into billions, carrying his work in every act of care. This is the unspoken promise, that creation itself was the first temple and you are its light. So when you feel alone, remember Nazareth, not the village, but the silence it represents. Remember the mother who bore divinity with courage, the brothers who learned to love in his shadow, the sister who vanished into prayer, and the generations who kept walking when the world stopped believing. They were not divine by nature. They were divine by remembrance. And so are you. Every act of kindness is the scripture continuing. Every humble life that chooses peace over pride adds another line to the unwritten gospel. The story did not end with resurrection. It began there. For resurrection was never only one man's return from death. It was the awakening of love that cannot die. Even now, in this age of noise and forgetting, the light waits in the quiet corners, in hospitals, in deserts, in the hearts of those who have no name in history but are known by heaven. It moves through time like fragrance through air, invisible but unmistakable. It is the sound of mercy, the scent of dawn, the pulse of eternity hidden within the ordinary. And one day, when humanity grows still enough to listen again, the light will speak not as thunder but as whisper. It will say, "You were never forsaken. I have been with you in every kindness, in every breath, in every tear that led you back to love." And in that moment there will be no more separation, not between God and man, not between heaven and earth, not between the sacred and the simple. There will only be remembrance, for the light that never left is not coming back. It never went anywhere. It lives in the heart that dares to love again after loss, in the voice that blesses even its betrayers, in the soul that kneels not out of fear but out of awe. That is the end of the story and its beginning. The world began with light. And it will end with it not fading but returning to its source, where every name, every heart, every prayer is one and the same. Breathe now. The story has been told and yet it has no ending. It drifts through you the way wind passes through a field unseen, yet changing everything it touches. Close your eyes. The family is still here, not in the dust of ruins, but in the pulse beneath your ribs. Mary's patience, James's quiet faith, the sisters' vanishing grace, they live in you. They always did. Somewhere in the hush between your thoughts, the same light that once burned above Galilee flickers softly. It does not ask to be worshipped. It only asks to be remembered. The empires that tried to own it are gone. The temples that tried to contain it are dust. But the light remains, wandering, breathing, finding its home again inside the human heart. You have carried it since the beginning, though you may have forgotten. It is in every breath that forgives, every tear that cleanses, every silence that heals. You are not waiting for heaven. You are part of its remembering. The story was never about the past. It was about this moment right here, right now, where all that was divine once again becomes familiar. The light walks beside you when you are kind. It speaks through you when you comfort the broken. It rests with you when you surrender your fears to peace. Do you feel it? That stillness between breaths. That is the sound of creation breathing with you. That is where the Holy Family still prays, not from altars of gold, but from the quiet sanctuaries of human hearts. Tonight, you return there, to the garden where the fig tree blooms again, to the small home of Nazareth where love first learned how to speak. The lamp is still burning on the table. The window is open, and the same wind that once carried angels' wings now moves softly through your chest. The light never left. It never could. It is woven through your being, ancient and alive, waiting for you to rest long enough to remember its name. So sleep now. Let the noise of the world fall away like sand. Let your spirit drift back to that quiet village where eternity once took its first breath. You are not lost, you are returning, and in your return heaven exhales. The stars remember their purpose. The earth turns gently beneath you, singing the same hymn it has sung since the beginning. All is one, all is light, all is love. Rest in that truth. Let it cradle you. You are part of the story that cannot end. The same light that walked among men now dreams through you. So sleep, child of the eternal. Sleep, bearer of the quiet flame. The family watches still, unseen, unbound by time. They whisper your name into the folds of dawn, and the universe, infinite and kind, answers back, welcome home.